We're going to be doing the four types of literary criticism today. And you remember, well, maybe you remember, from the first lecture that there's literary criticism isn't saying what's wrong with something. It's an attempt to understand it in different ways. And depending what kind of an approach you take, you'll come up with a different interpretation. The four types of literary criticism that we're going to be focused on are text-based, which means that the text is the center of the criticism. There are other kinds of criticism which we won't be looking at very much, which are not text-based. They take the story or the poem or whatever the work is, and they use it to get at different ends. For example, feminist criticism. If you approach a story, feminist criticism, the function of the work is to tell you something about the condition of women at a particular time and how this particular work contributed to what the culture was doing with women at the time. So that it doesn't really matter what goes on in the story, what matters is how women are treated in the story. So the function isn't the work itself, the function is what it can tell you about something else. If you had Marxist criticism, Karl Marx, the theoretician behind communism. Communism wasn't a bad thing, totalitarianism was a bad thing. It's hard to argue with from each according to their gifts, to each according to their needs. It's a pretty difficult idea to argue with, it just didn't work. Nevertheless, Marx says basically money talks. And every time you look at a work, when you look at art, art is determined by money. If you look at the Middle Ages, for example, to go a little bit away from literature for a second, all the art in the Middle Ages, or most of it, is pictures of something to do with Christianity. Now, for 500 years, were there no artists who wanted to draw naked ladies? Did they all want to draw saints? Or people being martyred for their faith? Why did for so long, why was that almost the only thing that artists drew?
The church had all the money then.
The church had all the money. That's exactly what Marx would say. Whoever has the money controls the art. When a Marxist wouldn't even, for example, need to read a book to find it useful. They could just pick it up. We got a paperback novel with cheap paper. The cover on it is a scantily clad young lady and two men in cowboy hats shooting at one another. What would Marx tell you that tells us about the culture? Who is that book aimed at? The intellectual elite? How do we know?
Well, what's depicted on the cover?
What's on the cover? It's all about sex and violence. Is that going to be a book that encourages people to do a lot of thinking?
No.
No. What kind of society, what level of society is that book aimed at? Is that the working class? Is it the middle class? Is it aimed at the managerial class? Or is it at the capitalist elite?
Working class.
The working class. Why would a society want to discourage the working class from thinking?
There could be only so many people at the top.
There can only be so many people at the top, and they want to stay there. If you have the working class starting to think, they're going to think about, hey, how come I work so hard and make so little, and people who don't do much work at all make so much? I make the tires. Why shouldn't I get the biggest part of the money that the tires brings in? Why does somebody who did nothing but manipulate money make such a huge amount from it, and I'm doing all this hard work? So in other words, Marxists would look at it and say, this is really capitalist propaganda. This is the subtle ways in which money and those who have money manipulate the rest of us. How do we know this was a working class, intended for the working class, this book? What's it look like? cheap paper and it's paperback. It's cheap. Everybody can afford it. If we were trying to aim this at the wealthy, we would have made it hardbound. We probably put a little gilt on the outside. There's plenty of sex and violence in literature. In fact, that's pretty much all there is. But you can find that from classical times. You can find examples of that that are a little bit more difficult if that was who you wanted to aim it at. So Marx would look at that. A Marxist critic wouldn't care so much what's in the book, except to look at it and say, this is how people are being propagandized and manipulated. This is how money creates art. If there's existential criticism, which we really won't be doing that much of, but actually we'll be doing existentialism when we get to the end of the course, but we won't be doing as much existential criticism. Now, existentialism, as you're going to see eventually, is a philosophy. Basically, it says there's no God, everything is a big accident, everybody dies, death is the end of everything, the world is basically meaningless, that isolates and alienates everybody. Yes, Mr.
Go
Goldberg.
about a lot of freedom in it too.
The freedom comes in that there's nobody holding you responsible. So you're absolutely free to do anything you want. In other words, whatever you can get away with without punishment in this world is not going to be punished in the next, because there isn't any next. And the existentialists see themselves as the only really free people because they're not, what they do is not being determined by the hope of reward or the fear of punishment in some distant future after they're dead. That all their decisions are really their decisions. And that they're the only ones who can actually make a free choice because they've accepted that the world is meaningless. And it's impossible to live in it.
Isn't everyone trying to attain freedom?
The existentialists would say probably not. They ought to be. An existentialist thinks we ought to be trying to attain freedom, but in reality, hardly anybody wants to be free. To be free is an enormous burden.
Really?
Well, look how many decisions everybody makes every day without thinking about them. They do them because that's the way it's always been done. That's what people expect them to do. If you had to stop and think about every action that you did and whether it was right or wrong, and that's what an existentialist does. I mean, an existentialist measures every act and says, by my personal standard, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? And the proof of whether I believe it's a good or bad thing is what I do. In other words, the existentialist thinks talk is cheap. It comes down to action. What you really believe is what you do, not what you say. So they see themselves, they measure, or they at least believe they measure, every action in their life, not in terms of what has always been done, not in terms of what this society want me to do, but in terms of what I believe is right. So they see themselves as being free. The moment when you realize that you're going to die, and that death is the end of everything, it's called the existential moment. And an existential critic judges a work in terms of how well it explains or describes the existential condition. The fact that we're in a world that doesn't mean anything and we have to have some way to assign meaning because people can't live in a meaningless world. I mean, if you really do die, nothing matters. Nothing matters.
I mean, you have idealism, realism, I mean, everyone incorporates a lot of those attributes into one being. You know what I mean? Like.
Meaning the one philosophy?
Yeah.
Yes, and each one that
Take a
gets.
mixture of something else and put it in.
And a lot of them are similar. Idealism and romanticism and anti-realism have a lot in common. They just have a different emphasis. Existentialism and existentialism is just naturalism carried a step or so further, and an attempt to deal with what naturalism shows you. The realists go out into the world and they find out the world is basically a huge trap, and nobody survives it. That turns him into the naturalist. Well, if you accept that the world is meaningless and it's a huge trap, why wouldn't you just cut your throat? There has to be some way around that. So existentialism comes in and says, well, we have to act as if we were really creating the morality of the world. An existentialist critic says, how well does this book get people to understand the existential nature of the world? Or how well does it portray the existential moment? Somewhere between 12 and about 16 or 17, everybody hits the existential moment. The moment where, at least for some brief period of time, you think about you ceasing to exist. Personal annihilation. That's terrifying. Most people can't handle that, and so they go to idealism, according to the existentialists. They go to idealism, or they go to religion. They find some way to deny that truth about the world. But that moment when your stomach drops out of you, because you think about no more me, and it really becomes real for the first time, that's called the existential moment. So the existential critic looks at a work and says, how well does it explain existentialism or put people into existentialism? You may have been going blithely along thinking, well, the world has got some meaning and I am going to live forever one way or another and there is some sort of afterlife. And then this work makes you realize that there isn't. An existential critic says, then that's a great work. But it has nothing to do with the work itself. It has to do with what the work tells you about existentialism. Just like when you look at feminist criticism. Fenimore Cooper, Last of the Mohicans. Anybody ever read that or saw the movie? What are the women like in that? Do they think a lot?
Very submissive.
Yeah, they're very passive and submit. And the book is worse than the movie. In the movie, they seem at least like human beings, though limited human beings. When you read the book, they're these little mannequins. I mean, they have no interior life much at all, except Cora, who falls in love. But passion is as far as it goes. The intellect never really enters into it. For Cooper, the only function women have is as kind of trophies that men fight over. They're helpless in themselves. They can't think for themselves. They're not particularly brave. They're just these things that somebody kidnaps and runs away with, the bad guys, and then the good guys have to come and steal them back again, and then they get lost, and somebody has to go and find them, and they're in despair, and so somebody has to cheer them up. Now, if a feminist critic looked at that, one, what would they say about the depiction of women? That it's accurate? No, what would a feminist say? How did anybody get to even read that book and go, oh yeah, these are women? How did that happen?
Well, you have to take the time period into account, though.
Good point. It's the early 1800s. What was the position of women then?
They didn't have a big position at all. They were for like procreation, I guess. And that's really it.
They run a household and have children. They weren't encouraged to think. In fact, and you'll see this throughout most of the historical period we're going to look at, women's intellect is generally seen as being inferior to that of men. So it was assumed women didn't have any brains, so there was no point in drawing a woman with an interior life when everybody knew they didn't have them. How did this cause women to respond in the 1820s? Did they accept it? I'm sorry. They believed it. Everybody believes what everybody else believes. In other words, nobody has such a good grasp on reality that they're certain of it, except maybe a few psychotics. Most of us validate our experience with other people. Have you ever said, is it cold in here or is it me? I mean, you don't even trust your own senses. You have to validate them with somebody else. And the psychological experiments all indicate that we change our reality in terms of what other people tell us. There's that experiment where if we singled out somebody who wasn't here today, and we agreed that when they come in next week, one after another, we would go up to them and say, are you feeling all right? Boy, you look terrible. You sure you're okay? No matter how good they felt when they came in, by about the fifth or sixth person, they'll say, I don't know, I felt great when I came in here, but I'm really feeling a little bit queasy now. You can change people's view of reality. Reality is irrelevant. The only thing that really matters is what people believe is reality. And if they believe that women haven't got any intellect, then women who have an intellect think there's something wrong with me, I'm malfunctioning. They don't generally think there's something wrong with the world. And everybody expects women not to think, so even when they do think, well, what happens when a woman comes up with a brilliant thought at a time that says women can't think?
Somebody else steals their idea and says it's theirs.
Somebody else steals their idea because it won't be taken seriously if it was said by a woman. That couldn't possibly be true. I mean, it's a real question, for example, in how much of Einstein's early work was really his wife's work, who he pretty much, well, I don't know if he exactly drove her crazy or the times drove her crazy. I mean, imagine being a brilliant woman at a time when nobody would take your ideas seriously. And there you are, a step ahead of all the other physicists, and nobody will give any credence to what you do. And when you come and take a class, and everybody, generally when you're starting out to learn, you're shaping up your own ideas. And so some of them will be a little bit off, and if you came back 10 years later when you've really got your personal philosophy pretty much honed, some of those will look like errors to you. But that's the process of developing your own philosophy, is you flounder around for a while, you try different ideas on. Well, imagine whenever you tried an idea on, if your professor said, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. And he said it not because it was stupid, but because you said it, because you were a woman having that idea. And whenever you said something that was insightful and brilliant, he just ignored it. You can see how that might drive you crazy. But there is some disagreement about how many of his ideas are really his own, and how much of them were built on her original ideas. Same thing with Ralph Waldo Emerson, who creates Transcendentalism, and writes this about 20 or 30 page essay on the Oversoul, the Godhead, what the Godhead is. And then we discover that his wife, now he had been putting his works out for a while, so it might be, and she had read them. So it may be that she had read them and she was good at condensing, and she had condensed his ideas. But the same basic ideas that are in the 40 pages of the Oversoul are in a 2-page letter that his wife wrote 20 years earlier. So how much of that was really his and how much was hers, and she didn't really say much about it being appropriated by him, because she knew society wasn't going to give her any credit for it anyway. So when a feminist critic looks at a work, it says, how did this work contribute to the condition of women at that particular time? Well, when you give women images of them being helpless and not having an intellect and always having to, and being basically a prize for men to fight over, that's what they become. The same feminist critic might look at The Awakening by Kate Chopin, in which a woman with 3 children and a fairly nice husband, not real exciting, but not a bad person. I mean, remember, this is a time when husbands routinely beat their wives. And he's not brutal at all. He tries to do everything he can think of to make things good for her, and she just doesn't want to be married anymore. She doesn't want to be married to him. He's not exciting. And the children are such a burden to her. And she sees a young guy and decides to have an affair with him. Anybody know how that story ends? 19th century, a woman has an affair outside of marriage. What can you be sure is going to happen to her by the end of the book?
She's dead.
She's dead. Guy has an affair, 3, 4 of them. He can repent at the end of the novel, and his wife or his girlfriend will take him back, and everybody lives happily ever after. But chapter 1, as soon as she starts unbuttoning her blouse, dig the hole, because you're going to need it to put her in sooner or later. At the end of The Awakening, she swims out into the ocean and drowns herself. And it's the only way the book could have ever been published at that time. Why? If you look at her now, I can't remember the name of the central character. Does she seem a villain to you?
Because she had an
because she had an affair, because marriage was too limiting for her, because she had children that she didn't really want to be a mother to anymore. In contemporary society, would she be a monster? No. She's really a modern woman, but she's in the 19th century. In the 19th century, to find your children a burden, there had to be something wrong with you. 19th century believed that marriage was the epitome of a woman's life, and rearing children was the highest thing that you could possibly do. And any woman who wasn't satisfied with that had something seriously wrong with them. She hasn't got a brutal husband. Her husband isn't even mentally cruel to her. He tries to please her. He's just not very good at it. You were in a relationship, I'll have to really address this to the women. You were in a relationship like that where your boyfriend, your husband, your significant other is really kind of boring. And you just realized that he's kind of boring. In fact, he's very boring. And then this really hot-looking guy comes along. How many of you would bail? Oh, nobody's admitting that. Never mind. I shouldn't even ask that question.
Isn't that called divorce?
Sometimes people get around to divorce in those situations. See, that's the other problem. Why didn't she just leave him?
That wasn't acceptable either?
I can't hear you.
That wasn't acceptable at that time either?
That wasn't acceptable. Nobody would have talked to her. She's upper middle class. So having social relationships is extremely important to her. Society's very classed and structured. She would have no friends. Even other women wouldn't have anything to do with her. She would have been seen as a monster. But even if she could stand the social isolation, what's another big problem for her if she leaves the marriage? 19th century. There's nowhere to go. Her parents won't take her back. They'd want to know, was he beating you? Was he drunk all the time? Does he bring his mistresses home? Why are you leaving him? In fact, most of the time, if your husband beat you, what would your family do in a good portion of the 19th century? If you came and sought sanctuary, they would send you back. They would tell you, well, we'll have a talk with him. Depending how roughly they talk to him, maybe it might do some good. But the idea was, you can't break up a marriage. You have children now. You can't abandon that. What would she have done for a living?
Prostitute.
That was about one of the only jobs open, prostitute and school teacher. And personally, if I had my choice and I was a woman and good looking, it wouldn't be that much of a choice. You could hardly make ends meet as a teacher. Now, there were starting to be some factory jobs open, but the factory jobs, there were some, even as early as the 1700s, there were mills and things that women could work in. But those were working class women. This is an upper middle class woman. She has zero skills. She's probably not all that tough to begin with. And hard physical labor, swimming out into the ocean looks like the better alternative for her. And then probably it was, considering that. So there's no real jobs open for her. There's no way for her to stay alive. She's either got to stay in the marriage that with a husband she doesn't love and doesn't even like, caring for children that are just a burden to her, or kill herself. Although the choices seem, much greater to us, they aren't to her. So a feminist critic looks at this story and isn't as concerned with the character as they are with what it tells you about what happened to women who wanted to actualize who they were in a society that just had no opportunities for that and absolutely denied even the possibility of it. So in other words, they wouldn't focus on the work. The work would be something to tell you about feminism. Now, generally, we won't be looking at those types of criticism, and we won't be looking at, there is one other sort of text-based criticism called, the guy who does it is named Derrida, and I guess I'm forgetting the name of it because I don't like it so much. Deconstructionism. What it says basically is, Words are symbols. They symbolize different things to everybody who looks at them. And so there's no actual inherent meaning in the work. What meaning there is has to be gotten for you by the critic who intervenes. I mean, to me, this is the most preposterous approach to literature I've ever heard of. It says the critic is more important than the writer. That's like saying the reason for dogs is so fleas have someplace to live. Not only that, if Derrida is right and there's no inherent meaning in the book because words don't have a single meaning, then Derrida can't possibly have a meaning. So by his own philosophy, his philosophy has to be nonsense. But he's got a French name, he teaches at Harvard, nobody understands what he's saying. And you would think that if you were a professor at an Ivy League college, when one of your colleagues expounded a theory that you couldn't follow, you would say, this guy's just an idiot. He just can't put his ideas together. What do they say? Must be brilliant because I can't understand it. The same thing the rest of us generally say. Oh, this is too deep for me, so it must be me. And so Derrida's deconstructionism, which is I think that's the current fad. I have to depend on Professor Callender to find out what the fads in criticism are, because he comes in and tells me them all the time. He goes to these English teacher meetings and then he comes back with ideas that drive me nuts. More and more, the literature and the lives of the authors themselves have become a means for expounding one cause or another. So that things like Hawthorne was molested by his uncle. Emily Dickinson was an incest victim. Whatever the particular cause is, there seems to be this movement to turning everybody's literature, everybody's art into a consequence of their having been victimized in some way. So along with the victimization of the population at large, you have the victimization of artists. And what that says is that Emily Dickinson didn't write great poetry because she had a brilliant intellect and because she had deep feelings that a lot of other people didn't get themselves in touch with. It was all had to do with their victimhood. So he tells me that stuff just because he knows it drives me crazy. But deconstructionism is one of which we won't be going into at length. What we will be focused on are the four text-centered ones. And basically, they're the traditional ones. And what they say is there are different ways to approach literature. The first one says, biographical criticism, says that every work of art is the sum total of the artist's experience up until the point when they write that work. Well, if that's right, and the work is the sum total of the author's experience, what do you need to know to fully understand the work?
What the artist has been through.
What the author's been through. You have to know about his life. And the more you know about his life, the more you'll be able to understand his work. For example, Edgar Allan Poe. If you look at Edgar Allan Poe's poetry, there's a beautiful woman usually in it. She's always pale. It always ends in her death. And there's a lot of blood and gore. Now, if you don't know anything about Poe's background, you would look at that and go, what kind of a twisted individual is this that has blood and gore mixed up with love? Where did he go wrong? But if you know that Poe's mother was an actress, she was very beautiful. She died of consumption when he was 3 or 4 years old. Consumption is tuberculosis. Your lungs basically waste away. It makes you very pale, and at the end there's a lot of hemorrhaging. There's a lot of blood and gore. And that Poe's last memory of his mother was of a beautiful woman, blood and gore, and loss. In other words, instead of being this twisted character that somehow had violence and blood mixed up with love, he really looks like a person who suffered a tragedy very early in his life that he never really got over. And in fact, that tragedy kept being compounded because it seemed like everybody that Edgar Allan Poe fell in love with, or loved in any way, his stepmother, his aunt, his wife, the mother of his best friend when he was 13 that first encouraged him to write poetry, every one of them got tuberculosis and died. They all died that bloody, hacking death. so that every time he seemed to, even if he could have forgotten his mother's death, there would have been all those other ones in the meantime to remind him of that. So his preoccupation with blood and loss, his association of love and loss, seemed to be more because he was the victim of a series of tragedies than it was because he had some warped idea of what love really was. In other words, if you know about his biography, then his poems tend to have a totally different meaning for you. They're not gruesome and something you would turn away from. They're tragic. They're sad, rather than being terrifying or frightening. The same thing with a lot of Poe's works. For example, Poe was certainly an alcoholic, and more than likely also a drug addict. He was probably addicted to opium, especially in the form of laudanum. Laudanum is opium mixed with alcohol, and it was commonly available. Laudanum was probably one of the most frequently prescribed drugs at the time. Not surprisingly, it was prescribed a lot more often for women than it was for men. Any woman who was dissatisfied with the limitations of her life seemed sick or crazy to her husband, so he would take her to a doctor, and a doctor would prescribe laudanum. Well, laudanum is opium. If you refine opium once, you get morphine. You know what you get if you refine it twice? Heroin. So there are all kind of people who think they're taking their medication, but are in fact taking the equivalent of heroin. And these are ordinary housewives. These are ordinary women who have just can't adjust to what the 19th century demands out of them as wives and mothers and objects generally. And they don't even know they're addicted. Well, if you take heroin, how active are you? How outgoing? And
Not very.
not very. It's not one of those drugs that makes you euphoric and makes you think you can change the world. Later on, when the patent medicines started to have cocaine in them, come to think of it, that actually is the time when women start to break out of the mold. So when men were trying to put them to sleep because they were talking too much and they were too annoying and they were unsatisfied, they changed to a different medication that made them feel euphoric and full of energy. Maybe it's just a coincidence of those two things happen to happen at the same time. In any case, Poe's addicted probably to laudanum and definitely to alcohol. When you read his stories, a great many of them have to do with somebody who was a good person and who starts to take alcohol, starts to take drugs, and becomes a monster. A lot of the characters in the story are borderline crazy. In fact, some of them are just plain crazy. When you read The Black Cat, and this is one of the significant things that Poe does with horror. Prior to Poe, horror stories, and they were legitimate literature at the time. When Romanticism starts out, and we're going to get to Romanticism eventually, the Gothic novel, the scary tale, was one of the first kind of novels written, and that was considered to be real literature. Now it's not considered real literature anymore. It's considered genre literature, and it's not considered serious. No matter how well Stephen King writes, he will never, never, never get the Nobel Prize. And he won't get a Pulitzer either, or any other serious prize, because he's written horror novels. Now, he's written some straight novels too, but it doesn't matter. It's like being an ex-hooker. You may get into acting, but you're never going to get an Academy Award because of your background. In any case, the horror novel had been around for a while. And they all dealt with the supernatural. It was always evil that you couldn't see, haunted houses, ghosts coming back, demons possessing people, devils. When you read Poe, Poe shifts horror from the supernatural to the psychological. Scary thing about Poe is that the people in the story don't seem like they're crazy until it's too late. You start to read the Black Cat, which will eventually, I think we read in here when we do Romanticism, so I don't want to get too far ahead on it. But when you start out with a narrator, well, I won't even do the black cat, the telltale heart. Starts out with a guy who sounds perfectly sane and rational, and tells you that he had this landlord, and he liked the landlord. Landlord was kind of a nice guy, but he had this one milky eye. It's apparently a cataract. And the eye started to take on a kind of horror for him. He couldn't stand to look at it, but it's what Conrad called the fascination of the abomination. And that is the thing that you can't stand not to look at. How many people stop and watch traffic accidents, turn away, throw up, and turn back and look again? People at horror movies, oh, I can't look. Well, it's the fascination of the abomination. It's you can't really turn away. And so he gets obsessed with this eye. And he starts to wonder, does the guy sleep with this eye open or shut, since he can't see out of it anyway? And he starts creeping into his room at night with a little lantern, looking at the eye. And then, of course, he makes a sound. The guy wakes up. All the murderer can see is the eye, and he strangles him. And then he buries him under the floorboards. Now, up until that point, you have what you thought was an ordinary person. And he turns out to be a homicidal maniac. And the terror in that is, if you can't tell a homicidal maniac from an ordinary person in a story, how good are you at it in real life? How many people are you talking to every day that may at any instant pick up an axe and bury it in your brain? That's the terror. So he shifts it over to the psychological. That and losing control. The character is very rational, and then he loses control. And then usually when he goes crazy, he gets extremely rational again. But it's a mad kind of rationality. It's based on premises that are insane. But the reasoning from there on out, see, that's always the problem with schizophrenics, especially paranoid schizophrenics, if they're very bright, and often they are, is that their delusions are self-consistent. If you grant them their initial premise that aliens have infiltrated the human race, and especially have taken on the positions of psychiatrists, if you grant them that premise, everything else they say will start to make real sense to you. That's one of the great dangers of being a psychiatrist, is you start to buy into the delusions of your patients. Because what if they're right? What if there really is a great secret plot everywhere? And everything you bring up to them to try to prove that there isn't a plot, they can turn around and make it seem like that's part of the plot too. So Poe kind of does the same thing. He gives you this madness and you're not sure of... Here's a person who loses their grip on reality. What's the guarantee that you're going to keep yours? That terrifies people. Now, in his stories, he writes a lot of stories about live burial. And so people who aren't biographical critics look at this and say, well, he was obsessed with being buried alive. That was a craziness. It wasn't as crazy as it sounds for him to have been obsessed with being buried alive, assuming that he was. And other than the writings, there isn't too much evidence that he really was, but people assume, because he wrote so many things about live burial, that he himself was terrified of being buried alive. Well, it's not that crazy for a couple reasons. One is the drug that he took made you catatonic. Well, junkies, after they've shot up, you probably don't know any, but you've read about them. What are they like? Very animated, they giggle a lot, they talk endlessly? No, that's the potheads.
They sit still.
They sit still. They look like they're dead. They go on the nod. You have to go over and pinch them to see if they're still alive or not. Well, it's the same thing with laudanum, with opium. You look like you're dead. Now, you might say, well, that's all right. People would have figured it out. But it's not that easy to find out who's dead in the 19th century. I mean, even now, I fall off the chair here. You're going to want to know if I'm dead or not, because if I am, there's no point sticking around. You get out of class early. How would you do it? How would you know whether I was dead?
Nudge you with a stick.
You could hit me with a stick, see if I respond. What do you got to lose? Oh, I was just trying to wake you up.
Check your pulse.
I'm going.
Check my pulse. Athletes have a strong but a slow pulse, and a lot of muscle will make it hard to find. And well, I am, but the fatter you are, the harder it is to find a pulse, even a carotid pulse after a while. So that would be a good way to start, but it might not tell us for sure. You might not find a pulse. So I'm hoping you'll try other methods. What's the next one after the pulse?
Check your breathing.
See if I'm breathing. My chest rising or falling. Some people are shallow breathers anyway. And when you go into a coma in certain, the tail end of certain diseases, especially in the 19th century, there's a thing called Cheyne-Stokes breathing, where the person takes a deep breath in, and then they stop breathing for 2 or 3 minutes sometimes before they expel a breath. And they take another one in. So if somebody walks out while you're breathing out and breathing in, and comes back in and says, 5 minutes since I saw a breath here, they're not a pearl diver. I think they're dead. So it's hard to tell if your chest is going up and down. How else? Well, you might listen for my heart, but again, the heavier I am or the more muscular I am, the harder it's going to be to find that. And in Poe's day, 1820s, 30s, 40s, there's no stethoscopes. You could put a glass, somebody could have put a glass on his chest, that amplifies the sound. But the most common glass in America was a whiskey glass. And they were generally full. Americans were major league drinkers in the 19th century. So their ability to tell the dead from the living was somewhat impaired as well. Fail-safe mechanism was put a mirror in front of the person's mouth and see if it fogs. Works good in a cold house in January. August, by the time you pull the mirror away and take a look at it, it's not fogged anymore. So even your fail-safe is not going to work. So determining whether he's dead is not a guarantee anyhow. The other difficulty with that is that people don't know you're dead because you're really just in a drug-induced coma. They're not waiting around a lot of time. Generally in those days, this is a way that the times differ significantly, and that is that people died at home for the most part. They didn't go to hospitals to die. They died of stuff we don't die of, and a lot of times they died relatively slowly, and death was a ceremony. I mean, everybody in the family, you didn't die in the hands of strangers in those days. Your family was generally there and had been there, and they kept watch to see if you had died or not. And when people died, they said their farewells. 19th century, people died, they were going on a journey. They expected to see their loved ones again, and their loved ones expected to see them again. I mean, they grieved because you don't have that person for the next 20 or 30 or 40 years, but they didn't grieve the way the 20th century grieves because they didn't think death was the end of everything. So it was very kind of ceremonial, but there's a problem to that. The body lays in state, usually in the parlor, and more distant relatives and neighbors come and say their goodbyes. One of the things that I think screwed up the 19th century so much was the habit of picking little kids up and sticking them into the coffin to kiss grandma goodbye. That's got to have some psychological effects on you. Well, here's the problem. If Poe had just died, and he was afraid he was going to die in a heat wave in the middle of August. Problem there?
Smell.
The smell. You put 5 pounds of hamburger on the kitchen counter in a heat wave. What happens in 2 days?
It's rotten.
It's rotten. You can't go in the room. So you got 120 pounds of grandma getting ripe in the parlor. You're real anxious as to get the services started. Poe's afraid his friends are going to say, look, Edgar smelled none too good normally. And he's getting worse by the minute. Let's get him in the ground. Of course, his friends are all junkies. Why would they have been anxious to get him buried? You don't know any druggies, so you don't know how they think.
His stash.
They would have got his stash. Edgar would have wanted us to use this up. Let's get him buried, and then we'll all divide it up, and we'll all, let's see, they smoke their opium. Or they'll drink the laudanum, and we'll have one last toast of laudanum to Edgar, and then we'll sit around and talk about good times. And of course, they were all fallen out, and people would have come in and said, oh, look, they all died. Would have served them right if they'd have buried them as well. Poe was afraid his junkie friends were going to be real anxious to get him in the ground to divide up the drugs that were left. and they weren't going to know if he was dead. Most of the people around him, when he went into that state, were going to be fairly impaired themselves, and even if he had been up and walking around, wouldn't have been any too sure that he was alive. So he had a legitimate fear of being buried alive. So the biographical critic says, well, if you know that he was a drug addict, then his live burial stories don't sound nearly as crazy as they sound otherwise. So the biographical critic says the more you know about the author, the more you know about the works. And it goes down to what part of their life they write the story in will give you a different interpretation. For example, you write a love poem when you're 12. You write a love poem when you're 16 and you've just fallen in love. You write a love poem when you're 16 and you've been dumped. You write a love poem when you're 35 and you've been dumped a lot. Are they going to be the same poem? How are they going to differ? What's your 12-year-old poem about love going to be like?
It's gonna be really nice to start out with, over time.
Sweet, idealistic. You don't really, 12, sex doesn't really enter into it all that much. Although in our culture, I guess maybe it does. But you don't have the same understanding of it that you're going to have. So it'll be idealistic, it'll be sweet, everything will be wonderful about love. You fall in love differently. I mean, you can have a crush, you can be in love when you're a child. Everybody dismisses the children. Children sometimes form as deep attachments for people as adults do. We just disqualify them because there's no sex involved. That doesn't mean that you can't make a deep emotional attachment just because there's no physical dimension to it. In fact, when you get to romanticism, they'll tell you the only true love is idealized love, is spiritual love anyway. But in any case, 16, after you've fallen in love, what's that poem going to be like? Well, it's much more likely to be about passion than about the ideal. You're not writing about an idea anymore. Now you're starting to write about an experience. Well, how will it change after you get dumped the first time?
Like the end of the world.
At the end of the world, I'll never love again. Everybody's a liar. You can't trust anybody. I'm never falling in love again. This is terrible. I won't be a fool twice. That lasts about 48 hours until the next really charming person comes along. But it's going to be bitter or bittersweet at best, probably kind of suicidal. What about the poem you write at 30?
I'm used to it already.
Yeah, you get used to it. That's one of the things about getting old, and there isn't much good about it at all. In fact, there's hardly anything good about it. And if you take one piece of information out of this class, it's this: don't get old. Stay young as long as you possibly can. But what was right before that? Falling into one of those craters. Right before don't get old. Had to do with
30-year-old.
love. Right, being disappointed. If you live long enough, you'll have lost so many times that what once would have been terrible disasters and failures will seem unmitigated triumphs. Your expectation of the world will lower so much that the mediocre will seem wonderful to you. And so you're satisfied with an awful lot less. So you write that poem, by the time you're 30, you're used to that. You know, relationships are real tough. It's hard to make them last. And maybe you've had a whole bunch that didn't last. So this time when it doesn't last, you go, yeah, I knew it. Hey, I was figuring on 3 months, it went 6. I was in bonus time. And you're not thinking, oh, this will never happen to me again. I've lost my one opportunity for happiness. You're thinking, another week or two, I'll bump into somebody else, things will start all over again. So your expectation is going to be different. So the biographical critic says if you know when in an author's life he wrote that, you'll understand what his attitude towards his subject was. What was it that he was drawing on? Was he drawing on somebody else's experiences? Was he drawing on his own? And how did those experiences shape what it was that he thought about the world? And the more you know about them, the more you know about why the writing comes out the way it does and why it means what it means. If you read early Mark Twain, I mean, he was known as a humorist. His stuff is still funny, even after all this time. And all his early books are basically humor. And it's not really dark humor. I mean, there's satire in it, and he does make fun of some people. Generally, people deserve to be satirized. But when you read the last works that Twain wrote, they're about as bitter and dark as it gets. The Man Who Corrupted Hadleyburg. A fortune is found by these people with a note on it saying, I came through Hadleyburg when I had nothing, and these two people were kind to me, and I want them to have this fortune. And everybody in the town, Hadleyburg has a coin that it prints with its motto on about how it's incorruptible. These are the incorruptible people, and they're all so good. And every single one of them lies, one after the other, to try to get the fortune. And then the guy who put the fortune there shows up and says, there were no two people. All of you have lied. You were rotten to me, and you were so hypocritical and self-satisfied when I came through here. I set this plan out to destroy you, and I've succeeded. Even more depressing is the mysterious stranger. The mysterious stranger, an angel appears to these kids in a small town. I think it's in Germany. And they're real impressed with him because he's an angel. Of course, he's a dark angel, but he's an angel nevertheless. And he tells them he's an angel, and they're pretty impressed with that. And they say, well, do some angel kind of stuff. What can angels do? And he says, well, I can tell you what's going to happen. He said, well, tell us something. Father, what's his name there, is going to step off the curb in a minute or so and get run over by a wagon and killed. And the kids are horrified. They said, well, can you do something to stop it? Yeah, sure. Well, do it. So he twitches his nose or whatever it is that angels do to change things. And Father, what's his name, goes to step off the curb and pulls back, and the wagon goes by and it doesn't run him over. And the kids are overjoyed. Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you, thank you. And the angel says, well, it wasn't as wonderful as you think. See, Father What's-His-Name believes that if he lives a good life, he's going to be rewarded for it. And if he does something terrible, he's going to be punished forever. And if he had been run over by the wagon now, he would have died expecting bliss, and that's what he would have gotten. But he's going to live another 20 years. He's going to do some really awful things. And when he dies, he's going to expect torment, and that's what he's going to get for eternity. Oh, now the kids are really bummed out. So he tries to amuse them. He makes these little people. And the little people start to build stuff. And then they start to squabble, and then they start to fight, and the angel goes, wipes them all out. And the kids are horrified. Hey, we're little people. How could you do that to people? They were being... Don't worry about it. There's more where they came from. And the book, it goes on for a fairly long time. And finally, at the end, the dark angel says to the kid, haven't you figured out what it's all about? And the kid says, no. And the angel says, you are all there is. You are the only being that exists. And faced with the terrible loneliness of an eternity, of being the only being that exists, you have made up this elaborate fantasy of which even I am a part. And it's my function to appear every once in a while in your fantasy and remind you that there's only you and the great, endless loneliness. This is not a happy story. Now, the biographical critic says you need to know that early on in his life, when Twain was young, he was adventurous. He goes out to California with his brother, goes to the gold rush. He works on newspapers. Everybody's getting rich and losing a fortune and getting another fortune every couple days. That all goes away. But he's got a great job paying him to travel around the world and write stuff on it. And he's making a living off his writing, and things are great. And then when he's in the Holy Lands, he runs into another American. American's got a necklace with a picture on it. And he falls in love with the picture. And it's the guy's sister. And when he comes back to America, he goes to visit her. She doesn't like him very much at first, because he chews tobacco and he swears and he's kind of unkempt, and he's a writer, and that's not a real dependable profession. Remember, in those days, women are looking for a husband who will bring home the money you can depend on. Otherwise, your old age is going to be miserable, your children's lives are going to be miserable. But gradually, he kind of grows on her. And they have this lifelong love affair. And they have 3 children, and Twain doted on his children. Right before he writes Hadleyburg and the Mysterious Stranger, he goes broke. He had all of his friends invest their money in a typesetting machine, and it failed. Now, he was under no legal obligation to pay them back, but he felt because he had encouraged them to do it, he was responsible, and he paid back all the money that they lost. But in order to do that, he had to go on this speaking tour in England. While he's gone, his favorite daughter, I mean, he loved all of his daughters, but the youngest one dies unexpectedly. His wife goes home. He has to stay on the tour. I mean, he can't even go back for the funeral. His wife dies within a year. His other daughter dies. His third daughter has epilepsy, which was at the time was fatal. And he's in his late 60s or early 70s then. His personal powers are waning. Nothing that he's written satisfies him anymore. And everywhere he looks, he sees betrayal. And he starts to talk about the damned human race. And he writes Mysterious Stranger. It's never published in his lifetime. It's not published until 1912. No publisher would have touched it before the 20th century. The biographical critic says, if you wonder how a guy who seemed to be as happy and outgoing as the early Twain is in all of his works could end up writing anything as bleak as he does, you need to know about his life. And you need to know when in his life he was writing that and what was going on, because with Twain especially, so much of what he writes derives from his personal experience. Life on the Mississippi. He was a riverboat pilot. When he was a little kid, the riverboat pilots were the kings. I mean, they were what everybody wanted to be. They made a huge living. It was not a lot of people could do it. You had to memorize the river. And the river constantly changed because it was cutting its banks, and sometimes it would cut 20 miles off. There wasn't a bend there anymore. Where did the river go? You had to know every little curve in it. And so only a few people could really learn how to do that. And so everybody looked up to them. It was real romantic and adventurous. And he got to be one. He got his life's wish. And so he draws on that. So when you look at Twain, you see somebody who's always drawing on their life. So the biographical critic says the more you understand about their life, the more you're going to understand their work. So the first place to go is to the biography. There are problems with biographical criticism. And they have to do with what you can actually know about the life. For example, you may become a pillar of American literature. But when you're 6 and 7 and 10 or even 12, nobody knows that. So they don't record everything that you did. Everything we can probably know about somebody's childhood is memory. Well, how well does memory work? Do you think you have an absolute accurate memory of your 5th birthday? If you want to see how accurate your memory is, assuming that you got videotapes or movies or something from when you were 5 years old, write down everything you can remember about your 5th birthday. Who was there, what they were wearing, what they said, what kind of things you did at your party, and then go to the videotape. And what you'll find is there were people you were sure were there who weren't there at all. And the people didn't look the way you remember them looking at that time. And the clothes are different than what you thought they were wearing. And some of the events either didn't get on the videotape or happened in a different year or didn't happen at all. We're all probably now at the point where in your lives where you start to discuss the past with your siblings and you talk about family events, and do they agree with everything you remember? generally they have a whole different impression. 3 people lived through the same set of experiences, but they got them from different directions. And you remember them in completely different ways. My sisters insist that I remember stuff that never happened. And they're probably right, because my wife keeps telling me I remember stuff that never happened either. That's one of the big difficulties in not being able to tell reality from what goes on inside your head from what goes on outside your head, which is always a problem for writers. When you write, as some of you know, the characters become real. You enter their world, and for a while you're spending 5-6 hours a day in a world which doesn't actually exist but is completely real to you. One of the reasons maybe why writers go crazy as often as they do is because that distinction between what we normally think of reality and alternate realities breaks down, and they get less and less good at being able to tell one from another. So one of the problems with biography is the truth of it. We can't access the early parts. It's all got to do with somebody's memory, because generally you're not writing down the daily events of your life when you're 6 years old, or even when you're 9 or 10. Let's say somebody did keep a record. Can we trust it? You keep a diary, not a journal, a diary. What's the difference between a journal and a diary? In a diary, you put down your most inmost secret thoughts, and nobody is ever expected to read a diary. A diary has a lock on it. A journal is an account of your life which you expect future generations to read. Up until the 20th century, people regularly kept journals that they passed on for their children and their grandchildren, so they would know what life was like for their ancestors. So you expect people are going to read it. Well, let's say we've got a diary. We've got somebody's diary where they were never expected anybody to read this, so we can expect them to be telling the truth. What about the truth? Can we trust what they put down? Why not?
Because sometimes people write personal things in the diary that are kind of made up, you know what I mean?
The way you have an event happen, and like you have an argument, and you get that great comeback, but you're already at the car. So when you write it in your diary, you forget that you were at the car when you thought that up, and you write down that that was the comeback you had. You won the argument. You had the great final line. You write stuff in there that didn't happen. What about the stuff that did happen? Is your view of the events of your life objective? We like to think it is, but everything that happens is colored by your emotions at the time. In other words, if you're really upset, you miss lots of details, or you misinterpret a thing. The classic situation comedy plot. Somebody writes a note that's about one thing, and they leave it laying around, and their girlfriend finds it and thinks it's a love letter to somebody else. So let's say that happened to you. You went and wrote in your diary, and you would write about what a rotten person you had gotten yourself involved with and how they had betrayed you and you can't trust anybody. And then you find out it wasn't a love letter after all. Next entry says exactly the opposite. They weren't a rotten person. I really misjudged them, but it wasn't really my fault. Are people real good at recognizing when stuff is their fault? Most people aren't. Mostly, especially the younger you are, the more it's always somebody else's fault. Whatever you get into is because somebody made you do it. Something they did got you in that situation, so it isn't really your fault at all. So even if we have a diary, the odds are the person is not telling us what really happened, but only the way they would have either liked it to have happened, or the way they remember it as happening, or the way it should have happened. So we can't even trust that. What happens if we don't even have any journal or diary? We're going to try to figure out Twain's biography. We're going to try to figure out his life. He's been dead for 100 years. Well, let's say he just died recently, a year or so ago. Where would you go if you were going to try to construct a biography of Twain?
Talk to his friends and family.
You talk to his friends and family. Are we going to get absolute truth there? Think of your friends and your enemies. Imagine somebody was going to write a biography of you. Would they get an accurate account? Probably not. All of your friends. In fact, if you died and got to come back and read your biography, you'd find out that you had bosom buddies that you barely knew. People who met you once or twice. When the biographer comes around and says, well, I understand that you grew up with Twain. As it happened, you were in 3rd grade, he was in 4th, you only saw him at recess and he beat you up once. That was your only real contact with him. Well, you want to get in this book. You're an ordinary person. They're quoting you about Mark Twain. This thing is going to last a long time. So when you start remembering stuff that never happened between you and Twain. You're probably not going to say a lot of bad things about him, even if you know some of them, because you think the biographer doesn't want to know them, although the biographer wants to sell books too, so he may nudge you in the direction of, well, was there anything peculiar about him? Did he ever do anything that you know that nobody else knows about him? So, actually there isn't, but I really want to get into this book. And I do know a story about somebody. It wasn't actually Twain, but that's okay. It's a great story anyhow. I'll tell it as if it was Twain. So when you go back, when you're trying to do biography, you can't really trust your sources. How about the biographies that were constructed during the person's lifetime? Say 50 years ago. Can you trust them? Same problem. I mean, maybe it's even worse if the person's alive. The biographer comes to you and wants to know something about Twain. You know some real adventures that Twain had. Are you going to tell them? Probably not. You don't want Twain calling you up on the phone or coming to your house and going, why did you tell him that stuff? What's wrong with you? Now I've just been indicted because of that. So even the contemporary biographies aren't going to be necessarily that accurate. So one of the arguments against biographical criticism is the validity of the information. Can we know enough about people's lives to really base it on that? The biographical critic says we can certainly know, there are certainly events in people's lives which everybody agree happened, which they agree happened, that had to have some effect. One last point. It is legitimate to argue from the life to the work. In other words, we know these are the events of somebody's life. We can then say this is how they affected the work. It's not legitimate to go from the work and make up stuff about people's lives. For example, we know Whitman was homosexual, and he wrote about it. We know who his significant others were, and we know what his relationships were like because he wrote about them, and other people wrote about them at the time, and Whitman didn't deny them or disclaim them. So it's legitimate to say, how does Whitman's homosexuality affect what it is that he writes? But it's not legitimate to go to Moby Dick and to the chapter where the sailors who have just captured a sperm whale, and they've emptied the spermaceti into this great big vat. And the spermaceti has clumps in it. It's got to be made into oil, into whale oil. So all of the sailors are all elbow deep in sperm, squeezing sperm, touching each other's hands, and looking lovingly into each other's eyes, thinking about the brotherhood of man. And say how Melville was really a homosexual and nobody really knew about it because of that chapter that he wrote in that book. Can't go from the work and say stuff about the life. You can only go from the life and say stuff about the work. Let's take a break until 3:05, and then we'll keep going with these types of criticism. So despite the drawbacks to finding the truth for biographical criticism, the biographical critic nevertheless says we can know enough about people's lives that we can interpret their works in terms of them. Now the second kind of criticism is called historical criticism. And what the historical critic says is that although the biographical critic is right, the work is the sum total of the author's experiences. Those experiences are determined by their times. For example, for all of his horror stories, Poe never wrote a story about a plane crash. How come?
There weren't any planes then.
There weren't any planes then. His times determined that. Poe didn't say, "Oh, I'm not going to write any plane crash stories." His times determined what he was going to be able, what experiences he could have. And the historical critic says, what you really need to know is not so much the events of an author's life as the times, what the times were like. And that the times not only determine what events can happen in an author's life, they also determine how and what he can write. For example, Scarlet Letter. Now, the biographical critic says that, well, let me back up a second. How many of you read the Scarlet Letter? What's it about?
It's about a woman who commits adultery and is forced to wear the scarlet letter A upon her gown for the rest of her life.
It's about adultery. A woman has to wear the scarlet letter is the scarlet A she has to wear. So it's a book about adultery. How many graphic sex scenes are in it?
None.
None. Not one. Book about adultery with no naked people in it. How can that be? Written in 1850. How come?
Wouldn't be appropriate for the time, people wouldn't read it.
People wouldn't, it would never have been published. People would actually have flocked to read it if they could have, but it wouldn't have been published if there had been any graphic sex in it, because sex wasn't talked about. In fact, anybody know what young ladies were expected to do if anything remotely connected with sex or anatomy was mentioned? They were expected to faint. Married women could blush. They didn't actually have to faint. But young unmarried women, or even old unmarried women, were expected to faint. And they practiced fainting. And they tried to stand around near something soft so they could swoon back onto the divan instead of having to fall on the hard floor. And the kind of things they had to faint over are incomprehensible to us. For example, you couldn't say the word pants. You had to say trousers. You couldn't say leg. You had to say limb. So if somebody's brother fell off their horse, came running in and said, "Oh, I just had an accident. I ripped my pants. I hurt my leg." Young ladies are falling out all over the room. These are the people who put the fig leaves on the statues and the little trouser legs on the furniture. Well, I put them on the. You haven't heard of the trouser legs on the furniture? You know when you're on a diet, like about the second or third day, everything you see is about food. Tire commercials comes on, it's chocolate donuts. Well, it's the same thing with any drive that you repress. When you repress sex, it starts to come out in the same ways. How many of you have had abnormal psychology? Kraft Ebing? Does that sound familiar to people in the shoe fetishists?
Yeah.
People in love with, people getting sexual pleasure out of shoes. And I think, how twisted is that? Comes out of the 19th century. 19th century women's clothes come down to here, come up to there, long skirts, high boots. About the most you saw a female, I mean, there were people married, had 11 children, had never seen one another naked. Guys hung out at the carriage stands where you could get like a taxi, because when the women stepped up into the carriage, the skirt came up and they saw a boot. Well, it's not too long. It's Pavlov's dog. You ring the bell, you feed the dog. You ring the bell, you feed the dog. You ring the bell, the dog salivates anyway. You show them a boot, they feel good. You show them pretty soon, because there's an ankle. You don't even need the ankle anymore. All you need is the shoe. And so people get focused on the shoes, and then you end up with those bizarre kind of things that you find in Kraft Ebing. Well, in a place where boots are a turn on, guys are really repressed. There's not, I mean, now there's more, there are acres of flesh in the average commercial. I mean, we don't even notice things which would have just been, images which would have been beyond belief to a 19th century person. We just look at it and they're not even erotic to us because we've been bombarded with them so much. But when there's nothing like that, everything gets to be a turn on, and particularly for guys. So after a while, you have guys sitting around listening to somebody's daughter play the piano, and they had those, the Chippendale kind of furniture where the legs are sort of shaped like legs, and guys being guys are sitting around looking at the furniture going, "See the legs in that piano? Look. And then their wives are going, "Oh my God, they're being turned on by the furniture." So put little trouser legs on the furniture because sex is forbidden, it's not talked about. Just the last 5 minutes would have gotten me horsewhipped in the 19th century. So when you can't talk about sex, you can't put it in print. Now that doesn't mean there weren't people writing what might even be called pornography in the 19th century. There was a lot of it. But legitimate literature didn't have sex in it. And in fact, the Scarlet Letter, if that book were written today, how many graphic sex scenes would be in it? Yeah, dozens, every other chapter at least. Hawthorne's agent would have sent the book back to him. "Nathaniel, this is a religious tract. Nobody's going to buy this. Get these people naked in chapter 1. When there are things which you can't mention, what are the things that everybody has to know? What can't be mentioned? Otherwise, they would accidentally be mentioning it. So that what happens is when you live in a society that can't say certain things, everybody knows what those things are, and they're used to filling in the blanks. The stuff that's left out is apparent to them, whereas we look at it and now you can talk about anything. So we assume that if an author is talking about a thing, they're going to put it in there. And if it's not in there, then they're not talking about it. 19th century, the author could be talking about it, but they can't put it in, so you have to be alert to put it in for them. Everybody has to know the things that can't be talked about. So that when Hawthorne says, "Woman pregnant woods," that's all he has to say. They fill in all of those scenes that were left out in the book, because that's what they're used to doing. We, on the other hand, expect that when people go to bed together in a novel, we get to go with them. We get a description accurate enough to serve as a technical manual if we happen to be in need of one. So the author has to fulfill the expectations of the audience. Now, Scarlet Letter was considered an immoral book anyway in the 19th century. Remember that thing about women having sex? What has to happen to them at the end of the story? They have to die. Well, what happens to Hester Prynne at the end of the Scarlet Letter? Yeah, she's not only alive, she's triumphant. The people who made her wear the A now look like the villains. She's more virtuous than they are. She's a much better person. So the 19th century said, well, what is the message of this book? Improve your life through adultery? You can become a better person by breaking the rules first? So this is a terrible message to be given to young people. This is an immoral book. And it was banned in a lot of places. So the historical critic says the kind of reading, the expectation of the audience, determines what gets published, and it determines what an author could write. The biographical critic would have said Hawthorne was a kind of cold, aloof guy. He wasn't one of those, the people who touch you when they talk to you? That wasn't Hawthorne. Hawthorne shrank from physical contact, as far as we know. So the biographical critic would have said, there's no graphic sex in Hawthorne because Hawthorne wasn't that experienced with it anyway. And he wasn't very comfortable with any kind of physicality. And so it never gets in his work. The historical critic says, it doesn't matter if Hawthorne was the Teddy Kennedy of his day. It didn't matter how much and how bizarre a set of experiences he had, he wouldn't have been able to put them in the book because the publishers would never have published it. Sex didn't appear in legitimate literature. It's one of the things that makes Whitman so striking, is that you get what are, for the time, extremely graphic descriptions of sex, and it's often between men. That was totally unheard of. People were stunned when they read Whitman, because Whitman was supposed to be legitimate literature. This wasn't limericks, this was real poetry. So they were shocked by it. So the historical critic says, what you can put in a book is determined by your times. For example, because some of the stuff we're writing is so old, you'll find in a lot of these works 5, 6, 10 pages of description in a row. Will you find that in a modern work? Highly unlikely. Very little description in modern work, and where there is description, it's worked into the dialogue. Why is that? Why did, say, the 19th century want 10 pages of description? What do you do if you come across 10 pages of description? Wade through it? Most modern readers skip on to the first piece of dialogue they can find. See if they can pick the story up from there. If they can't, they'll go back and sift through those blocks of print. But they don't prefer them. So why did the 19th century want these long blocks of description? A couple reasons. First of all, you have to think, for one thing, our attention span is shorter than theirs. Why?
MTV.
MTV was the one that really shortened it down to 1.5 minutes. For a long time, when television first came out, it shortened the attention span to 20 minutes. What happens every 20 minutes on television? It's a commercial. The function of television is not entertainment. What is the function of television?
To sell.
Advertising, to sell stuff. The shows on television are the equivalent of the juggler who came into town ahead of the guy on the medicine wagon. It was to draw a crowd. Once you had a crowd, the guy got up on the back of the medicine wagon and started selling his elixir of life to people. But his juggler and his fire eater, they were just there to bring the crowd in. Well, that's all television shows are for. To bring the crowd in so that you can get them to see the commercials. So because they were every 20 minutes, people got used to getting information in a steadily rising fashion that would peak every 20 minutes. Right before the commercial, you reach the peak of interest. And then they show the commercial, they resolve that, and then they start up another one. Or at least that's the way it used to be. Now, though, there's a lot of changes in people's attention span. It makes it much shorter. One was MTV. MTV was, when it started out, 1980, was more sensation in 1.5 minutes than the average person 100 years ago saw in their entire lifetime. If you took somebody out of 1850 and sat them down in front of MTV, they would go into sensory overload. They wouldn't even be able to process things. They would just be sitting there totally overwhelmed with it. More dazzle, more flash, more movement, more color, sound, all of the senses being bombarded. Totally beyond what they were used to. So MTV shortened our attention span way down. Probably the usual attention span now is about 5 minutes. When television started out, you had a drama with one central character, 1 or 2 sub-characters, one main plot. Sometimes a subplot, but not much. That all changed, especially about, I guess maybe 12 or 15 years ago. Technological advance made another enormous change in people's attention span, and that was the wireless remote. Prior to that, or, well, there was a cable box with a cable, so it wasn't wireless. But prior to that, first of all, there were only 3 channels anyway, and people had to get up and walk all the way across the living room and change the channel and look and see if they liked it or not, and then go on to another one. Sometimes it got up to be maybe 5 or 7 channels. Now what, there's not, if you get the right kind of satellite dish, there's 900 channels. I mean, that's not entertainment, that's a life. You'd have to spend all day long just going, by the time you got through 900 channels, your show would be over, the one that you liked. There are, once the remote comes along, it means that you can change channels whenever you want. And what they discovered was 5 minutes is about as long as people will normally put up with whatever they're watching if it doesn't catch their interest. Then they'll go to another channel. Well, they want you to stick around to the commercial. So how do they beat you to that? How do they beat you to the clicker? How do they beat you to the remote? Nighttime television drama. Single character, one main character.
Ensemble cast.
Ensemble casts, 7, 8 main characters. Do they take one character a week and do him all the way or her all the way through the show? No, they run through all 8 in little 4-minute segments. Right at the beginning of the show, you get introduced to a problem or some event of interest for this character, and then they go on to, then they quickly jump to the next, and then the next and the next and the next. Every time you're reaching for that remote to change the channel, they beat you to it. They move to another character because they know that those characters, are they all similar or all the same? No, they're all set up demographic to appeal to different demographics, the different sub-audiences. So in other words, there's a character in there for the 12 to 15-year-olds, there's a character in there for the 16 to 18-year-olds, and the 20 to 25, and the 30 to 35, and fewer characters the further up you go. But there's somebody in there of interest to every small marketing group. And they run through them because they know they'll get you with one of them. And if they do, you'll stick around until your character cycles back again. And in the meantime, they get to show you a commercial or several commercials. Now there are differences in the way people use the remote. There are gender differences. In fact, I suspect, how many of you don't care who has the remote? One. That's relatively rare. Most people will kill to get the remote. And I expect that the next reason for uncontested divorce will be couldn't get the remote. Because whenever somebody else gets the remote, what do? Do they click the same way you do? No, they got a different pattern. Men and women have a different style. How do men click the remote? Quick. There are 49 channels. We've got 2.5 minutes here to get all of them. Somewhere on them there's a great hit or a naked breast, and we don't want to miss it. We've got 49 to do. How do women generally change channels? How do they click? Slowly. They go to it. This is unfathomable to men. They click on a channel, and they stay there for a while. And they decide, they get the feel of the show. And they decide whether they're interested or not. If they are, what do? They stay there. Guy sees a show that's interesting to him, what does he do? Makes a note of it, checks it out, goes on to the next. There's still 49 to go here. We've got to get through all of them. And then if women don't like that show, they click on the next channel. And then they get a feel for that. And if they like that, they stay there. And by that time, their male significant other is going, give me the remote. There are 47. We only got 15 seconds to do 49 channels. We've got to get through all of them. So I guess maybe male attention spans then are even shorter than women's attention spans. Yeah, I guess that's a surprise. So the fact that we have the remote is part of our historical period. And it makes a difference in the way things are written. You don't have single character, single plots anymore. You have multiple characters, multiple plots. The plots no longer have to have all of the elements in sequence. If you look at a 50s commercial on detergent, the person comes, it's a woman because it's a 50s commercial, puts the clothes in, pours the stuff in, closes the washer, and then they zoom in on the little dial, the timer, and we watch the timer go around to 0, and then she comes back and takes the clothes out and goes, ooh, how white they are. But a modern commercial doesn't do that. She puts them in, closes it, opens it right back up, and takes them out. Do we get confused? Do we go, oh, they clean instantly? Is that what we're seeing? No. But if you took somebody who was out of the 50s and showed them that, they would be confused. If you look at an old black and white television show, the police are going after somebody. They leave the building, they get in the car, we drive with them, they get to the place. How do most cop shows do it now?
You just see them get in a car and all of a sudden they're at the place.
They're at the place. They're here, then they're there. Do we get lost? No, especially your generation was brought up on television. You're used to coming into the middle of things. If you got any 80 or 90-year-old grandparents, they miss the first 10 minutes of a show. Will they watch it? No, they'd say, well, how will you know what's going on? You've missed half of it already. You only missed 10 minutes of it. It's 50 minutes, well, without commercials, it's 45 minutes long, but still, it's only a quarter. Younger people will come in the middle of a thing, and they don't care. Because they're used to figuring out what went on before they got there, and then they'll pick it up as they go along. There'll be enough clues as the thing moves along that they'll be able to figure out what went before. In other words, extrapolative thinking. A broad pattern recognition kind of thinking goes on with younger people. And the older you are, the more likely you are to have to go step by step, and the reason for that comes back to the same thing, television and print. If you're 80 years old, you grew up getting your information from print. And print goes step by step. What's better for finding detail, TV or print?
Print.
Print, because it sits still. You can go back and find out how many tanks the Israeli army has. But if you're watching a documentary on it and you didn't catch how many he said, you're out of luck. I mean, you could record it and go back to the videotape and find it out, but you can't do that until the show's over, not without losing more of the show. So in other words, if you're raised on television, you tend to be a broad recognition person. You tend to have general ideas, and you tend to be good at the flow of ideas. If you're good at the flow of ideas, you can start anywhere along a chain of ideas and figure out what ideas led up to it, as well, to some extent, what ideas are going to follow. But if you go step by step, and you miss a step, and you're brought up learning to go step by step, and a step is missing, you think you can't go on. So that's the times. In other words, in 1950, a writer had to put in a lot of things that somebody writing in 1980 didn't. And the 1990s writer doesn't have to has to put even less things in. Of course, he has to write more complex plots. He has to be able to get into more characters. He has to be able to write different kinds of characters. Can't always have the same kind of character the way you could. In the 60s, one of the arguments was, is the novel dead? And that what they meant by a novel then was generally a book about a single character which plumbed the depths of their internal life, their introspection. How many introspective novels are there now? Or let me modify that question. How many novels of a single person and everything that's going on in their head are on the bestseller list? None. People don't want that. Television has made them not want to delve into people's thought processes anymore. They want action. They want things that move. Television has got them used to multiple plots. You can't write a novel now if it hasn't got multiple plots, if it hasn't got subplots. You can't do it on a single character and what's going on inside his head. That bores people. The amount of description goes down. Previous centuries, when they sat down to read a book, expected to get a lot of entertainment out of it. In fact, generally in the 19th century, a book was read, was bought, and it was read around after dinner. The family got together, and the best reader in the family read several chapters to the family. When the book was finished that way, then individual members read it for themselves. After everybody in the family had read the book, it went around again. So that people might read the same novel 3 times in a 4 or 5 month period. I don't think if you weren't heavily armed that you could get an American to read any book 3 times. In fact, my guess is if you see anything on that reading list that you read before, even 5 years ago, you're going to think you can skip over it because, well, I read that once already. Why would I read it twice? There are too many books out there for me to read. The 19th century, though, expects to get a lot of entertainment out of it. One of the reasons why it wasn't boring for them to read 10 pages of description is because they had an ability which most of us don't have. And that's the ability to take words and turn them into mental pictures. Well, why aren't we as good as the 19th century was at that? Were they smarter than us?
You see it on that.
Yeah, we see it on television. Television makes the pictures for us. It makes pictures better than most of us can make in our imaginations. I mean, artists get enormously highly paid to create striking visual images. Most of us aren't artists. And so the images we make up on our head probably wouldn't be as good as those anyway. And because the images are always made for us, we don't have to develop the ability to turn words into pictures. The 19th century did. That's why they could read it 3 times, because when you get 10 pages of description, that's a lot of detail. They don't all register the first time you read. So when they listened to a book the first time, they got a picture of what was going on. But it wasn't as sharp and clear as it was the second time when they heard that description again, and more detail stuck in their mind. And then the third time, even more detail. So that whenever they reread the book, they got a sharper and clearer picture, mental picture of what was going on. But we don't have those talents. We didn't develop them. So when we hit 10 pages of description, it's just agony for us. It's boring to get through all of that. The 19th century wanted to spend time with that. They liked making the mental pictures. They liked being good at that. Most of us, most Americans aren't really readers, and so they don't develop the ability to turn words into pictures. And of course, what that means is that if you're going to be a writer, you may do great description. You may be great at it, and you may love doing it. But if you want to make a living, you're not going to write much of it. Because when an editor gets, or a publisher gets that book, he looks at the first 10 pages and sees no quotation marks. It's on its way back. Thank you for letting us change envelopes on this. And you get it back in, you'd never get it published. Most of us, why do we skip on to the first piece of the first quotation marks when we read? Because nothing happens on television until something moves or somebody talks. Something moves is buried somewhere in that block of print which we're trying to avoid. So we skip down to the dialogue. And most writers now are working their descriptions into the dialogue. So it's what characters say. What reads faster? Description, where the lines go all the way across the page, or dialogue, where the lines only go partway across the page?
Dialogue, obviously.
Dialogue reads a lot faster. How about the length of books? Generally, except for maybe the fantasy genre, the international intrigue genre, and some mystery novels. Have books gotten shorter or longer over the last 150 years?
Shorter.
Shorter. People's attention spans are shorter. When you write dialogue, you get through it pretty quick. Even longer books are a lot easier and a lot faster to go through than books of the same length were 100 years ago, because of the kind of writing that's done. So in other words, the historical critic says the way a writer writes doesn't depend on his experiences and doesn't really depend on his talents as much as it depends on the expectation of the audience. The audience expects dialogue. You better get good at writing dialogue if you're going to make a living. And no matter how good you are at description, you're going to have to restrain yourself and keep it to a minimum if you want to even get published, let alone develop a following. Because the times have changed. And sometimes 10 years makes an enormous difference. That multiple plot lines comes about in about a year and a half. From the time the cable box comes in and people can change channels, within a year and a half, multiple plots, multiple characters was already part of television. And, well, so what? It was part of television. How does that affect what gets written? Same people read that watch television. They get used to complex plots, that's what they want to see. They get used to dialogue, that's what they want to read. So the writer, even though the writer may not watch television, has got to write a certain way because that's what the audience expects. So the historical critic says you need to know what the audience expects. When the historical critic, for example, looks at Poe's live burial stuff, he says Poe may or may not have been personally afraid of being buried alive. It doesn't matter. Poe was generally broke, and he had a right for wherever the market was. And the market was newspapers. New York City had over 100 newspapers, and it wasn't even a third as big as it is now. The newspapers published news, nonfiction, and fiction side by side. And they didn't make a distinction between the two. The standards, when you've got 100 newspapers, you can't expect that they're all going to be the New York Times. In fact, most of them are going to be, and were, a lot more like the tabloids than they were like even the Asbury Park Press, which is not the highest standard for journalism. The kind of writing that you got was basically sensationalist. It was difficult to tell it from fiction. They did the same as now, the same thing that television does. Even the Weather Channel lies. It lies to get viewers. And what gets people attracted, same as literature, sex and violence, and fear. The Weather Channel is always predicting the next flood. The snow is going to be 8 feet deep. The ice age is coming. Everything is hyped because you're in a struggle with 900 other channels for people's attention. So you've got to have something that stands out. Well, the newspapers at the time were a lot like that. One of the things which people were afraid of was live burial, being buried alive, because people did get buried alive. There was that difficulty in telling when people were really dead. Also, people weren't embalmed in those days. Now, if you die, they drain out your blood, they pump in chemicals, they sew your mouth shut from the inside. You're alive somewhere along the line, you wake up. 19th century, they just put you in a box, and after a day or so, depending on the weather, they nailed the lid shut and they carried it out and they put you in the ground. And if you were in a coma and came out of it spontaneously, you were in the coffin, and people sometimes did. The graves would wash out because they were on hillsides, and they would find the inside of a wooden coffin lid all scratched and clawed where the person had wakened up and come back to life. Now, that didn't happen real frequently, but it didn't matter. People believed that it happened frequently. When you die, your fingernails and your hair, which don't have a blood supply, continue to grow for a while. So often when the graves washed out, they saw a corpse with long hair and long nails, and I thought, oh my God, that person was alive in there until they needed a haircut and a manicure. What an awful way to go. But in fact, they weren't. But people thought that it happened. And what really made them think that it happened was that the newspapers knew everybody was scared of that, and so they did a lot of live burial stories. When they did what the tabloids often do, and that is, they'll run a story, and if they don't have another story like that, they'll run the same story again with slight changes, and nobody seems to notice. They did the same thing in the 19th century. When they thought that people were going to notice they were running the same true story, they bought fiction about live burial. So there was always a market for live burial stories. So the historical critic says Poe may have been afraid of being buried alive, but he really wrote them because that's what sold. He wanted to sell stories. There was always a market for live burial, and so he wrote live burial stories. So what is it you need to know if the historical critic is right and the times shape the work? Well, with the biographical critic, you had to know the life. With the historical critic, what would you have to know?
The times.
You'd have to know the times. And the more you know about the times, the more you're going to understand what's really going on in the novel. Because there are certain assumptions that an author makes that everybody accepts without ever talking about. Objects, for example. When I was reading Twain lately, he talked, I think it wasn't a pancake griddle. It was some other daily utensil that everybody who read Twain when he wrote it knew exactly what it was. And he was saying about how this object was shaped like that. But I had no clue what he was saying because I had never seen that. That is increasingly actually going to be the case. Where an author draws on a piece of current technology in a story, or to make a comparison, that technology is going to be gone. I mean, how many of you have ever actually seen an 8-track? Really? Wow, that's amazing. How many of you ever really have used a manual typewriter? So basically you're what, Quakers? You're really the Amish with somebody else's clothes on here? What do you do with these ancient technologies? Or else you're really all old people and you have these young masks on? Or like really good skincare or something?
You save and sell them.
I can't hear you.
You save them and then you sell them.
Oh, you save them and sell them. That's right, they're antiques now. They're artifacts from an ancient culture. Technology is turning over very rapidly. So a lot of the things that a writer would make a comparison to now won't exist in 5 years. Definitely won't exist in 10 years. Do any of you own records? I'm just astounded at this.
They're worth a lot of money too.
This is almost never the case.
I know, I've never seen a slide rule.
Oh, there's a great example. A slide rule.
What is this?
What is it?
It looked like a ruler, and the middle part of it slid out, and there were numbers on it, and by matching up the numbers, you could do mathematical calculations. It was like kind of you know the abacus where they move the beads around? It was sort of like
I
that.
have the abacus.
You have an abacus. Some places still use them because they're actually, in a lot of ways, they're quicker than people are with a digital calculator. But a slide rule, there wasn't, well, not long after the dinosaurs died, and I got into high school, they had slide rules, and everybody had a slide rule. And they wouldn't even let you use a calculator. People had to actually do long division and stuff in their heads, which I can still do. Which always amazes me when I go like to a cashier, and if the register doesn't tell them exactly what my change ought to be, they're at a loss. And if you give somebody, if it's $2.34 and you give them $5 bill and 34 cents, some of them just fuse out. It's like, ooh, higher math. I'm done. I don't know what to do with this. But there was a time when people actually had. So if a writer talks about, well, he got out his slide rule and figured it out, almost most writers go, what was that thing? So the times are going to change, even the metaphors that writers can make, even the comparisons that they can make. And stuff is going to date quicker than it used to. In other words, objects stayed around, pieces of technology stayed around for 50 years. That's not going to be the case anymore. The changes, even just with computers, we're probably not more than about 10 years from a big, bulky desktop being as obsolete as a manual typewriter. I mean, everybody will have One will, if you need a keyboard, it'll just fold out, but the odds are you won't need a keyboard anyway, because you'll just talk to it. Voice recognition isn't that good yet, but it's getting there. And it's like 80% accuracy. Have any of you tried the voice recognition software?
Yes.
And it works to some extent. It's like having a really old, partially deaf secretary who wasn't too bright to begin with.
It's a really long time.
And it comes up with these things that, it's like, how did it get that? Where did those?
They'll spell words wrong sometimes. Or,
And they'll have words that are totally different.
yeah.
But when you sound them out, you go, oh, that's how it confused it. And then you have to be kind to it because it is dumb, and so you have to say it over again. But it's not going to be long before you can talk just as rapidly as you normally talk, and your computer will be able to turn it into text instantly. So we're not far from that. So when people talk about, especially, you see this a lot in science fiction. I mean, here we are, it's supposed to be like 500 years in the future, and people are still keyboarding. I don't think that's going to happen. Probably in your lifetimes, you'll get the little chip in your head. It won't be a big operation. Everybody will want to get it, because it'll improve your memory, and you'll just be able to think. And we know now certain connections in the brain occur at certain places. So in other words, certain commands will always look the same, and it'll be wired into your head. You'll be able to think.
Didn't you tell us the first class if somebody comes down the road and asks you to put something into your brain, say no?
Yes, I probably did, but I don't think you will. Especially if they connect it up to your pleasure centers. We're done.
Gave us the description with the monkey.
Yes, that's what I think is probably going to happen. Because it's not, I mean, look how close we are with virtual reality now. I mean, that stuff is really getting real looking. So we're only 3 or 4 years from reality becoming indistinguishable. What's going to happen to writing then? I think it's going out the window, which is a sad thing if you're a writer, that words won't mean anything anymore. Once they start being able to map your dreams, people who have the best dreams will be able to sell them instead of having to put them into words. Things are, the turnover in your lifetimes is going to be greater than the turnover in mine. The turnover in mine was enormous. Don't forget, when I was a child, radio was the only thing around. And now, there are televisions that big, and that's only close to 60 years. Yeah, no, that's a really long time, but by the time 60 years of your lives have gone by, the changes in technology are just going to be beyond what we can even conceive right now. So this class is probably going to be absolutely useless to you later on in life. But it doesn't matter, you only need it for the credits anyway, and you all have jobs for the most part anyhow, so it isn't going to matter too much. Anyway, to get back to the historical criticism. If the historical critic says you got to know about the times. And the more you know about the times, the more you're going to understand the work. The third type of criticism is the literary movements or the literary tradition. And that's what a lot of the focus of the course is on. That's what Romanticism and Realism and Idealism and all is going to be about. These literary movements aren't categories that English teachers made up. They represent decisions that groups of writers, often generations of writers, made about what writing ought to be. And before they could make that determination, they first had to make maybe the first determination all of us have to make in order to live our lives, and that is they had to make a decision about what is real. What is reality? Now we're starting out in the classical period, which is why I had to read the Allegory of the Cave. Because the two basic answers to that question, what is real, are either Aristotle or Plato. Now Aristotle says the physical world, the world of the senses, is what's real. What you can see, what you can touch, what you can taste. The world that comes into our senses is the real world. Now there's a difficulty with following Aristotle. If the physical world is the real world, What does that mean about mortality? What does it mean about death?
When we're dead, we're dead.
When we're dead, we're dead. If the physical world is what's real, then your personality is an artifact of the electrical patterns created by the chemical changes in your brain. And when those chemical changes stop and that electrical pattern ceases, you cease as well. If Aristotle is right, we're all dead meat. We're all milk with an expiration date, if you agree with Aristotle. And we're going to be looking at writers that certainly did agree with Aristotle. The rationalists, the parts of the classical period certainly agree with him. The realistic writers later on, the naturalists, the existentialists, they all hold with Aristotle that the real world is the physical world. Now, at the same time as Aristotle, roughly, you have Plato. And Plato says the physical world is not real. The physical world is an illusion. And his explanation of that was what you read, the allegory of the cave. In the allegory of the cave, you have people who are in a cave. How long have they been there?
Their whole life.
Their whole life. They've never seen anything else but. They've never experienced anything but being in this cave. They're chained up so they can't leave. They're chained up so they can't turn their heads. What's behind them?
Fire.
There's a big fire. And between them and the fire, there's a low wall. So it's kind of on two stages. People walk past this wall carrying objects on their heads. Vases and images of animals and other objects. They carry them by. And because they're below the wall, all that you see above the wall is the objects. They don't see those objects. That wall is behind their head. What is it that they do see?
Shadows.
The shadows, the flickering shadows cast by the objects on the wall. What do they think about those shadows? They think they're real. That's all they've ever seen. And Plato says they get real good at making judgments about reality based on the shadows. They get to recognize certain shadows. They get to identify the order of shadows. People who can tell what shadow's coming next, if there happens to be a pattern of shadows, get a lot of praise and recognition for being able to watch and match those shadows. The other difficulty in them not knowing that the shadows aren't real is that the place has an echo. And whenever somebody talks on the other side of the wall, it bounces off and seems to come from the shadows. So they think the shadows talk. Now, he talks about a guy who gets released from his chains. And they take him up in the real world. What happens? First thing that happens to him. Can he see anything?
He's blinded.
He's blinded. He's blinded, but can't stand the light. All he's ever seen is shadows. So the light blinds him. Gradually, his eyes get adapted to it. First thing that he can see is shadows. He looks down, he notices shadows. And gradually begins to see his reflection in the water. And then eventually he's able to lift his eyes up and start to see the things. They show him the objects that have been being carried by behind his head all of his life. What does he think about those objects? Oh, good, finally I see reality. Yeah, he thinks they're fake. Look, they don't flicker, they're not distorted, they don't jump around. That's not real. This is some kind of illusion. Gradually, he comes to accept the objects as reality. Eventually, he's even able to look up at the sun, the brightest of the light. Then they put him back in the cave. Well, before they even put him back in the cave, Socrates asks, this guy who's come up out of watching shadows and now sees the real world, is he glad about that after he's been there for a while in the real world? Yeah. Would he want to go back to watching dancing shadows?
No.
No. He feels pity for those people who are watching shadows and thinking they're real. Then they stick him back in the cave. What happens to his eyesight?
It
Can't see again.
He can't see. Everybody else can see shadows. He's just come out of the light. He can't see anything at all. So what do they think about him? Wow, he's got great insights now. He sees stuff we can't see.
Comes back blind.
They think he came back blind. And they think that anybody who goes up, he went up with his eyes and came down without them. And it's just, nobody should want to go up into the light. Obviously, it just makes you blind. And it also apparently makes you stupid. Because when they say to him, well, they tell him to look at a shadow and say what it is, can he do it? No, he's used to seeing the real things. He hasn't watched shadows for a long time. And his eyes haven't really adjusted, and he can't name the shadows, and he can't tell what shadow's coming next. And they think that he's either crazy, or that he's gone mad, or that he's stupid. And they think that nobody should aspire to go up into the light, and if anybody takes anybody else up in the light, they'll kill them. And what does the allegory stand for? When he talks about the objects themselves, what's the light? It's the truth, the real world. And the journey upward is the journey of the soul. And the shadows are what we see. We're all watching a bunch of dancing shadows. This world, according to Plato, is a distorted reflection of a cosmic reality. Everything we see is just the misshapen shadow of what Plato called the ideal forms. And they weren't necessarily objects. For example, beauty is an ideal form. And the reason that we can see a beautiful painting and a beautiful person and a beautiful car is that they are all beauty distorted in a different way. They're shadows falling on a different part of the cave, and they're shaped in a certain way. But we recognize all of them as being a reflection of beauty. It's like you get up in the morning, you look in the mirror, and you look in the toaster, and then you look in the bumper of your car. You can recognize you in all three of them, but you look different in all three reflections. So everything in this world is a distorted reflection of that cosmic world. That world of ideal forms. Now there's a lengthy, well, it's probably a good place to break here. We're going to look next